Here we go. Thank you, Jane.
You're welcome.
So yeah, so what does all that mean? And what relationship is of any of it to what our author is defining as civil religion? Because I think within the great democratic experiment of this country, what that upholds is our choice to worship God in any way we imagine that to be. That's how I understand. And I know that there are people who are willing to defend that, even unto death. And it is about the choice to worship God. It is about the choice to be able to speak one's mind. All of those two things that are I can't think of the word I want, in our Constitution.
Explicitly expressed.
That explicitly expressed in our Constitution. Yeah. So what is all that? This is this sort of milieu that I think the trouble we are having today is that we don't have any forum to be able to explore all of these words and ideas anymore. I think that's how this country was born, in this place of imagination and possibility and hope,
And Thomas Paine.
And throwing and putting out ideas, and having people be able to talk about all of that. And today, it's so hard to do any of that. Go ahead, Pat.
I think back when the Constitution was written, we had a common enemy, which was England, and there was a unity with the people. And in today's world, it seems like the enemy is each other, and I think that's what's causing a lot of problems in our country.
But today some people are afraid to express their political views because of condemnation by someone else.
Retribution.
Mm-hmm.
And would be good to note that they didn't gather in that room in very hot weather and immediately come up with what they wanted.
Right.
They argued for a very long time, and the arguments were fierce.
And they weren't intimidated by that. They were still willing to talk and not stop because they disagreed.
And that was part and parcel of the discussions.
Yeah.
Was the debate, let's go this far. Let's go this far so that we know where we want to stop. Let's go this far so then we can figure out where we want to stop. Let's go to those edges so that we can find a center.
And the Constitution was not our first form of government. We had the Confederation first.
No.
And discovered that didn't work.
Okay.
So we already had a failed form of government going into creating the Constitution.
And that broke apart too. Now I forgot what I was going to say. It seemed important at the time, but it's lost now.
I always find it interesting that the framers left the edges fuzzy because they didn't know what was coming. but that gave us room to grow and change. And I find it really intriguing that today they want to put in cement what they think it means on some everybody's trying to say, no, this is what it means. No, this is what it means. But we just have shut our ears to each other. I just find it really interesting.
I
The faith
remembered.
they had in humanity. Carry on.
Yeah, and what you said reminded me of what I was going to say. So I think, I disagreed with what some of Gorman was saying in this chapter, but I think what he was getting at when he talked about the Constitution was how we have turned it into an idol.
So
And
Sean,
now,
tell us where
oh my God, yeah.
where you agree and disagree, because I think that's
Well, now I must confess that I finished the chapter, so I could be
you did go to,
conflating things.
and that's, I've done that too, because how do you talk about any of this without talking about American exceptionalism and extreme patriotism and nationalism?
Yeah, and I'm not sure where it is. I think oh wait, on page 46, he talks about in number 2, the corollary demand of solemn devotion and allegiance to the state as a sacred responsibility.
Did you say 46?
I'm sorry, 47.
Oh,
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of where he starts this conversation. And I think of things like, the flag. Yes, it represents the country and we honor that representation, but it's a piece of material. It's not God. It's not stomping on the graves of those who have died for the country. It's cloth. And we've raised it to this idolatrous status. And now we're doing it with the Constitution as well. And
Yeah.
if you don't agree with those constitutional originalists, you have no business calling yourself an American. And that is not what went on in that room where they argued out the points of the Constitution.
And
Right.
and that's what has now, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, because I'm just working this stuff out too. But that's where I think we now somehow define American patriotism, is with what you just said, Sharon.
Mhm.
The idolatrous upholding of flag and Constitution.
It's so interesting because when I was in college, there were lots of Canadians there. And so when they would raise the American flag, everybody would stand very solemn. And when they would raise the Canadian flag, we were hooting and hollering and screaming and, dancing. And we were just excited because we were acknowledging that we were crazy Canadians. And I thought it was interesting. A friend of mine, they had an American in their community and who was going back to the US. And so they did this American themed party. And she said, wow, these Americans, they just cried and cried and cried because we had a flag up. And I thought it was so interesting that the response was this adoration for a thing. And that's what she said. She goes, well, I never seen them like that, but they were so thankful for the flag. And I hear those words all the time. I'm so thankful for our flag. And I'm like you, it's a piece of material. I never quite understood that because I get nationalism and I get patriotism, not nationalism. I get patriotism. You all know I'm a Canadian. It's probably one of the first things you learned about me because that's important to me. But I don't understand that it's your core being as far as everything you think. I never quite understood this. even after 40 some years. I'm still confused.
On number 2, that commitment and practices,
Mhm.
it made me think of the teachers and the parents who are in disagreement about what, that parents have no say
Mhm.
against the institution of education.
Well, there's this meme going around Facebook that's, I won't quote it perfectly, I'm sure, but it's a picture of, I think it's probably the Little Rock Nine.
The little what?
The Little Rock Nine being escorted to school by US Marshals. And as Greg reminded me the other night, it was US Marshals who escorted those children to school. All of those children, Ruby Bridges, all of those children who broke segregation because they couldn't send out the National Guard because the National Guard was part of the state that was opposing integration. And so there's this picture of the US Marshals escorting these kids to school, and a bunch of white people that look just like us standing around them, screaming, holding up vile placards. And the meme is, so the people who opposed integration are now saying they don't want American history taught, so their kids don't know that they opposed integration. Well, it's not their kids, it's their grandkids probably. But yeah, we don't want that history taught because it reflects poorly on us.
And I've always thought that was for private schools, right? That, I mean, public school is public. There is
The
this.
curriculum is set by the school board, and the school board is populated with parents, people in the community.
Well, and that, if you there is a forum for this discussion. You get on the school board. I know there's a couple of school boards. The place I came from, I understand somehow the entire school board is now populated by people who homeschool.
No.
I'm not quite sure what happened there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be Loudoun County, Virginia.
Yeah, have this agenda that really just wants to dismantle the public school system. So that's beside the point here, but that
We've been blurring those lines of homeschooling in Wisconsin greatly, though. I mean, we homeschooled our kids, but we were not anti-public education. What we was anti, because in Wisconsin, a lot of people call themselves homeschoolers, but they're getting funded by the public from virtual schools, but they're at home. And that's really bad. That's really, really bad because we blurred that line of public and private. So then those people feel that they get a foot in both doors, but they're really made it difficult for public schools. I mean, I was part of a years-long fight that we lost to stop that from happening, because you lost the private education part of it, which is a right in the US, but we also lost the public education, the boundary. And that boundary is, the camel's nose was in both temps. And it's bad. I mean, we started that way back when we started with school choice in Milwaukee. It was bad way back in, what was that, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that's where it led us. And so now those people who are homeschoolers might not be homeschoolers. They might be getting money from the public funds. which is really messy, which is why those people now feel like they have a right to tell people, other people, what to teach their kids.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and they get that money, I mean, they get hardware, laptops, etc., and they're part of the public school system. But what really goes on in that teaching, I don't know.
Well, what's really interesting is they can also buy their own textbooks from their own sources. And that has been a real problem in Wisconsin. And that's bad. I mean, my kids always say, well, you know, we were homeschooled, but like we were like not like that. We were like doing these crazy projects, but you know, our group was really small because there weren't a lot of people who didn't want me to sign statements of faith and all kinds of interesting things.
Well, and I mean, there are a lot of homeschoolers in this area.
There are. Janesville
yeah.
has a really crazy, what's the right word? Philosophy that the homeschoolers in Janesville, there's a lot of them that have a really interesting philosophy of education.
And I used to know a lot of them when I worked at the library because they were very staunch library supporters and users. And so we purchased some of the things that they used for their curriculum, which, you know, on reflection, make my hair curl. But I loved those people and they loved us. And were the last people on earth who would have protested my right to raise my children as I saw fit. But that's not so much the case anymore.
Exactly. That changed drastically in the last 15 years. But that's has a lot to do with homeschool legal defense and that whole, I don't know, I could go on for hours, but I won't. But it's really, I was part of a very inclusive group of people. I mean, we had Muslims in our group, we had Catholics, we had atheists, we had all kinds of people in our groups. But that was not acceptable for most people. Anyway, so I think that it's just really crazy how we've blurred a lot of lines in the last 20 years. And that's made it really possible for so many people to start sticking their nose in other people's business, to put it mildly.
So what I think is really important in this conversation is, so what we will do is to sort of we will trace what our author says about empire and civil religion, because I think that's important for us to get clear on. And then this next piece of this chapter is absolutely astounding. And to remember that we're reading an ancient book.
It's crazy, isn't it?
And it's so incredibly important for us to keep that in our heads, that we're reading an ancient book. And you know, and when I some of my notes are things like, oh my gosh, right?
Oh yes, I have all kinds of exclamation marks and sounds familiar.
Right. So that's, I mean, maybe it's just, this is the time to be reading this ancient book. So let's see, were we officially starting on 39 and 40?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm looking at page 40 under the theopolitical text. So a critique of empire and manifesto against civil religion. So the first exclamation point is in the first paragraph.
Yeah.
Scripture constantly reminds us that there are other stories competing for our attention and our allegiance. One of those competing stories, perhaps the most insidious one, is the story of human power in the guise of deity. It is central to understanding and interpreting Revelation. So how does that
Can
land
you
on us?
explain that sentence more
Well,
clear?
well,
Not
that's,
more clearly, but
yeah, so how does that land on us? What does that, well, what does that mean as we hear that sentence today? And I think that it is, again, Revelation is an ancient story. And it raises up for me that any culture has competing stories. Now, I immediately want to make a moral judgment, because anytime you decide something is good or bad, that's a moral judgment, right? So is that, do we make a moral judgment about that? Competing stories. I think we don't. I mean, I think we receive that as a fact, that in our culture, there are competing stories. Now, I personally believe that the story by which I live my life is a great story. It's a story of wonder and mystery and intrigue and death and resurrection and new life, and it's amazing. And I am willing to devote my life to it. Now, the next step, however, is then do I insist that every person also devote their life to this particular story I believe animates life, right? I think that's the muckiness in competing stories. I think the answer to that question is no. I can't insist that everyone adhere to this particular story. I can live my life in a way that shows forth the efficacy of this particular story. I can love my neighbor, and that shows forth the wonder of this particular story. And I can even talk about it. But can I insist? Can I make you
insist or persuade?
Insist, persuade, convince, manipulate, all sorts of words that would go along with that. I think the answer to that is no. And when that happens, then we're in this other realm. And that's what I think one of the things Revelation is about. Yeah, I'm not gonna go too much further on that yet.
I've got something, Pastor Kathy.
Yes.
I'm thinking of not the idea of persuading others about where I am, but I'm thinking about that verse, and it's in 1 Peter, about being prepared to give an account for the hope that is in you.
Yes.
And that's kind of all I can do. I can only tell you about the hope that is in me.
Mhm. Mhm.
I can't twist your arm and make you believe it.
Exactly.
It's my experience.
Nor should you. I
Right.
think that's more to the point.
Right.
And it's also about when someone asks you, be prepared. It's not about go blustering in there
Right.
and demand that they listen to you.
And take away their own culture.
Right.
That's colonizing, not evangelizing.
Right. And creating a system that demands that the citizens adhere to that particular story, that particular set of beliefs, and that's where we are, that's the step from and it gets all mixed up in this democratic experiment, right? That's why this is so very hard for us, is that in this particular democratic experiment, everyone has the right to adhere to the story that they find gives meaning to their lives.
And yet, where on page 41, that second paragraph that starts with put simply.
Yeah, that's all underlined.
Yeah, me too. We have always had manifest destiny and American exceptionalism.
Right. And that's why I think this gets to be so incredibly muddy. And that's what, he lines it out for us in, as we move ahead in this chapter, what American exceptionalism is, what manifest destiny, and how these things are all tied up in each other. And that's what's muddying, I think, the experiment today.
And I thought of something when I was reading, that the only recourse I had in dealing with things was to go sit naked on a rock and contemplate my navel.
Well, and in that first paragraph, that's a continuation of Warren Carter,
Yes.
where he talks about street processions and feasting and funding by the elites, expressed honor, gratitude. All I could think of was 2021 CPAC and the golden statue of Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
As I think about
however you feel about him as a president, and I'm sure that by now you all know how I feel about him as a president, but that's blasphemous.
Yeah.
Yes.
What is blasphemous? Blasphemous?
The golden statue of Trump that they had at I can't remember what CPAC stands for.
Conservative Political
Action Committee. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and those bullet points right there. I mean, I drove by wherever I would have been driving recently, and I've seen a lot of interesting Trump signs, but I had never seen one that said God chose Trump. Right? That I saw it. So there we have these bullet points. The gods have chosen Rome. Rome and its emperor are agents of the God's rule, will, salvation, and presence among human beings. Rome manifests the God's blessings, security, peace, justice, faithfulness, fertility, among those who submit to Rome's rule.
And yet the whole idea of emperor being divinely ordained was carried over in medieval Christian countries.
It was.
Oh, yeah.
Those
Oh, yeah.
kings were ordained by God.
And then it becomes manifest destiny.
That's right.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
I was
God
just thinking about that.
to take over this land and to execute the people that are here. Right.
I keep thinking about all the countries and all the nations before us that did this too. We're always spiraling back to it, right?
Right.
Today we're Catholic, tomorrow we're Lutheran. So the king gets to decide what I believe. I mean, that whole idea.
Right. And I think, so here's Kathy preaching. I think it is the first story ever told. The story of Adam and Eve, the sin of idolatry. That is Adam and Eve's sin, is idolatry. We can be like God.
Mhm.
And that has been playing out in humanity forever.
So those are the high places, huh? The high places in the kings. Ourselves, me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And isn't this, I'm looking at page 42, middle of the big paragraph toward the bottom that starts with these 6 points. In the very middle of that, it was particularly important for Rome to capture the hearts and minds of common folk. And that was done especially through the media, processions, games, spectacles, statues, the standards carried by soldiers and coins. I remember some talk about having parades that gave fealty to Trump.
But if we take away all those things, what do we have? How do we express ourselves? Or how do we receive?
Right. Again,
What?
it's the muddiness of it.
Mm.
It's getting together on the 4th of July and having a parade with everybody and their mother in it,
Mm.
because that's so much fun.
Mm.
I think that is so much
Or
fun.
getting ready for Christmas and only being terribly concerned about the packages you're buying for people and the meal you've got to cook for 10 people and letting it go by that this is the celebration of the birth of our Savior.
Well, and knowing full well this rhetoric about the shipping containers are not getting into the ports, so we cannot have Christmas, is the big part of the big lie.
Christmas has been made so secular. You can have Christmas without ever mentioning Jesus, Son of God.
You can.
But you know, the interesting thing is who's upset about those containers and who's making lots of noise about those containers while they say Jesus is the reason, right?
Yeah.
Always confused by that.
Oh.
There was an article in the news about how China isn't getting Christmas trees made, and we are going to be in terrible shape because we can't get new Christmas trees. Who buys a new Christmas tree? We have old ones if we have, or you know, it's
All we
just-
got to do is go to the thrift store if we need another Christmas tree. There are thousands there.
you know.
Right. So part of it seems to me the imperial cult is this twisting
Yeah.
of the of everything. Twisting this story of love and And the accompanying, because you all know as well as I do that when you love, your heart breaks. So twisting this story of love and heartbreak and new life and resurrection into something ugly. But it wears a mask. It always wears a mask. Ugliness wears a mask.
And it creates fear. That's a lot of what we see. Someone there at Ortmeyer Hall said something about people are scared to express their political view. But that is really a ploy to keep us in our place and keep us in darkness, keep everyone in darkness so they can go about business.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, because it prevents us from having any kind of rational discussion about this.
And people who do express themselves to any extent are called radical if you don't agree with them.
I know.
Extreme, one side, one way or the other, right? I've never considered myself an extremist, but in this world I am.
Mhm.
In this world I truly am. So on page 43, Revelation is therefore a theopolitical text. God, that's a word, isn't it?
Mhm.
Theopolitical. We have to get our minds wrapped around that.
Mhm.
I don't yet, but that's what we're doing here. It makes claims about who is truly God and about right and wrong connections between God and the socio-political order. It challenges the political theology of empire and the religious ideology that underwrites it. And it reveals God and the Lamb alone as the true sovereign one, source of all blessings and proper object of worship.
Well, you should go on.
Yeah, you go on.
Moreover, Revelation tells us not only who is really sovereign, but also what kind of sovereignty the true God exercises, namely what many have called nonviolent and non-coercive lamb power.
Yeah, and that theme is really well explained in Barbara Rossing's book, The Rapture Exposed, which he uses over and over again.
I think the last part is important too.
Go ahead.
We must simply preview these chapters with this summary. The allegedly violent scenes in Revelation are understood properly as symbols or metaphors, not examples of literal military violence carried out by the God of and
In the Lamb. Yeah.
Yep, I've got that stuff.
So one of the things that as we read the text, so every time you go back into your text, you pay attention to those images of the Lamb carrying the bloody sword and
out of his mouth.
Right out of his mouth. Sometimes it's in his right hand. And what becomes important in that, and this is why Revelation can be difficult reading. What becomes important in that is to make sure you're reading the entirety of the text, because it's important to know when. Because Jesus is not, the Lamb is not leading the attack with a clean sword to be bloodied. the Lamb is holding the already bloodied sword. And there's redeeming, there's redemption, there. See, I mean, so those are the kinds of things that are, that become really important to listen to as we read the text. And to not pass this off, well, this is just another violent story about killing those that don't believe like us. It is not. So as we keep moving and keep reading, these are the things that we also listen to.
Today's morning prayer, New Testament lesson. We've been reading from Revelation, and today is the opening of the seals in chapter 6. It's kind of scary, interesting.
What is it, the opening of, Louise?
The scrolls, it started with horses, one
Yep.
for each of the 4 horses, and
Yeah.
now we're on to the 5th or 6th, I can't remember.
So then, go back to his wonderful chart on pages 17 and 18 and 19. So that when we read and hear those things, we can say, oh, yes.
And that's exactly what I was thinking this morning.
Yes.
Ooh, only 144,000 out of all those people.
Oh, yes. I remember reading that 144,000 means the fullness of God's people and
Yes.
God's chosen tribes. It doesn't mean only 144,000 people.
Yep.
I am so glad to have this chart. I think it's so helpful.
I always think with that 144,000 number, if that's really the number, then wow, there must be one every, decade or century that gets to go. It's like, wow, could we just be done here then? Like, have judgment.
Why bother? I mean, if I believed in a transactional God like that,
Mhm.
then it's like, well, then I'm going to do all the bad stuff I really, missed out on doing.
Right. Just make sure you have a coin in your pocket so you can make a change at the end.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing to me was, as I was reading the bullet points on page 42, I got to thinking, as I have often thought in these times, about the fall of the Roman Empire. And Domitian was 81 through 96. And the fall didn't begin until 395. So think of all the crap we still have to go through.
Yeah, we'll be long gone before.
Yes. And I feel sorry for our progeny.
Goths and the Vandals and the Visigoths.
But I think a lot about, our grandchildren growing up and what that world's going to be like. And the only thing I can do about any of that is to teach as well as I can teach while I'm here, and to leave my little itsy bitsy teeny weeny piece of the world in peace and with peace and love.
There's a meme that I've seen that says, the life you live is the lesson you teach.
There you go. There you
Sums
go.
that up.
Yeah. Okay. It's 9:55, but I did think on page 45, in the very center, the paragraph begins, is the United States an empire? That depends on several factors, including one's definition of empire. And he offers this definition for consideration. An entity that has come to widespread global or nearly global dominance through deliberate expansion by means of the extreme exercise of some form or forms of power, economic, political, military, and or religious, resulting in the creation of, I love this, colony-like clients of the entity and of enemies who perceive the entity as oppressive. Under that definition, I mean, we know for sure that there was a Roman Empire. We know for sure that there was a British Empire that whose whole purpose was to colonize everyone and everything and make them all good Brits.
And good Christians.
And Christians, yeah.
But without equality.
Yeah, definitely without equality.
Mm.
Equality, you know, that's one of the things that just doesn't seem to be a part of, you know, any of that. You know, you think about, so Manifest Destiny did come to us, right, from the colonization of Britain, just part and parcel of all of that. And there was never, there was never equality as part of that.
Mhm.
And even with our Constitution, it is not about equality. There was never a view in those words that you and I were a part of that. I
Well,
mean,
Billy was, but the
Billy-
rest of us weren't.
part of the equality
Well,
written in the Constitution. None of the rest of us were part of that. Why
well,
not?
and possibly, depending on how wealthy and how much land Billy owned, he may or may not have been.
Right, he would have had to be a landowner to be a part of that. Yeah, so I mean, and that's the argument, right? For as you said earlier, Annetta, that the edges are
Blurry.
blurry because we have in some places become part of that equality. Not in all places, but in some places we have become part of that equality. In some places, African American people have become part of that equality. In some places, I don't know if I can say this, Indigenous people have become part of that equality. I'm not quite sure of that. But that's the democratic experiment. Is those blurry edges and who is included.
It's 10 o'clock.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so
Can we finish the chapter for next time?
Yes. So 48, 49, 50, 51. There's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
But let's
63.
let's go. So page 56 is the structure of Revelation. And then let's read it all and see how far we get.
Because it's really all one of a piece.
Yes, it is all one of a piece. So we're going from, where are we going? 48? Is that right?
48, the ideology of America.
Yeah.
48.
Well, really, we stopped on 45 today, so.
Yeah, so we
Yeah.
can look at all of that. Okay, guys, that's a lot of work.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Safe travels.
Have a great week, ladies.
You too.
Okay, love you.
Bye-bye.
Love you too.
Bye.
Bye.
We are